What if TF2 had no bad weapons? This is, I'm sure, an exciting thought for many people that will probably never be realized because of Valve's allergy to changing anything important. But while it may never officially happen, that doesn't mean that it's not a fun thought experiment. So I wanted to theory craft some fixes for some of TF2's worst weapons, today of course for the soldier. This is the third video in its respective series, with the scout video being the first. I explain all the rules for the rebalances there, so it would serve you well to start with that one and work your way down the playlist if you haven't seen it already. But because it's been longer than intended since the last one, I'll quickly run down the rules here too, just as a refresher. First of all, I'm only doing buffs for bad weapons and not nerfs for good ones. I'm sure there are plenty of weapons that do need nerfs, but that's not fun, so we're not going to touch them. Second, I'm also including underutilized weapons in my definition of bad, because even if a weapon is strictly balanced, a good one should be one that people willingly choose to pick up. Third, I'm going to try to suggest two possible fixes for all of the really bad weapons, with at least one keeping the current concept fully intact. Balancing is fickle, and even the worst weapons have their fans, so this way you'll get at least something out of one of the suggestions. And fourth, I really shouldn't have to say this, but this series is just for fun. Obviously, these changes are never going to be added to the actual game, and the reason that I'm discussing them here is because I think it's fun to analyze every weapon and fix them accordingly. Also, because Soldier has a couple multi-class weapons that are shared with Demo and Pyro, I would encourage you to at the very least watch the Demo Man video first to get a better explanation of how I'm handling them there. So them's the rules. Once again, I will give my obligatory warning that a lot of these rebalances rely heavily on my own opinions and experiences with the weapon and are therefore just for fun. So with that out of the way, let's fix some weapons. The Liberty Launcher is a very strange weapon in the context of Soldier's primaries. It does a lot of things that may be slightly convenient, but it doesn't really have its own identity in the same way weapons like the Direct Hit or Black Box do. Despite what people think, it's honestly not horrible. The damage is obviously lacking, but it does have enough conveniences baked into it that it can occasionally be a fun weapon to use. It serves as a pretty good alternative to the gunboats that also frees up your secondary slot if nothing else, and I do quite like the synergy it has with stuff that gives you crits like the Crits Krieg or Halloween Pumpkins. But that damage penalty just hurts. 68 base damage per rocket really does not cut it against most classes, and even the squishies that it does handle relatively well would be dispatched even more easily with the direct hit. Especially with the release of the airstrike, I've continually wondered what this thing was even meant to do, because it seems like a mishmash of a bunch of disconnected stats. But despite that, I think there is just enough there to make something workable out of it, so here are my rebalance ideas. The far and away easiest tweak we could give to the Liberty Launcher is just slightly increasing the damage. It's not new or exciting, but I really do think a damage increase would go a long way into making the weapon a viable choice. If we lower the damage penalty from 25% to a mere 15%, we bump up each rocket's individual damage to 76 a pop, which is a bit more respectable all things considered. The other thing that I'd want to see from a design like this is the airshot mini crit stat that's on the direct hit, because on top of it theming with the item set pretty well, rewarding skilled play is always good. So while I will admit that it's not a very fun solution, I do think that a side grade that's based on user preference rather than filling a specific niche is a fine thing to have if done correctly. If we wanted to get a little bit more creative with it though, I think the most natural direction to take the current design is to make it more of a combo tool. By giving it a faster holster speed, a faster reload speed, and the same on-hit knockback as the rest of the rocket launchers, as well as perhaps increasing the self-damage resistance to come closer to the gunboats, I think you could make the Liberty Launcher into sort of the degreaser for the soldier. In lieu of being an amazing weapon to use on its own right, this version of the Liberty Launcher would let you combo well with the other weapons in your kit, most notably your shotguns and your shovel. This would let you pull off market gardens and reserve shooter mini crits a lot faster, making the synergy of the entire item set as good as I'm assuming it was intended to be. But yeah, as mentioned, the Liberty Launcher is a tricky weapon to fix. A damage penalty is massive for a rocket launcher, which means that it's up to the extra positives to make the weapon usable, and at the moment, they just really don't. The hardest part, though, is suggesting changes that don't overlap with the other rocket launchers, since the airstrike and the direct hit both cover a hemisphere of what the Liberty Launcher wants to be. So, even though they may have the potential to step on the toes of its brethren, I do think both of these changes would at the very least make the Liberty Launcher usable. The Beggar's Bazooka is a weapon that is quite divisive because of the very weird way that it plays. Some people really like the ambush-heavy playstyle that it promotes, and while I am not the biggest fan of the weapon as it stands, I do still think the concept of the weapon is pretty cool and should be preserved. In fact, with its newfound use in some of the higher competitive leagues, you could even argue that the Beggar's is one of the best launchers in the game and doesn't need a buff of any sort. And to a major extent I would agree, but there is one stat that I think people of any skill level will agree is rather dumb, and that is the accuracy penalty. Random inaccuracy, in my opinion, is worse than random and bullet spread. Sure, there are ways you can mitigate it slightly, but ultimately I think inconsistency is a very lazy way to balance a weapon. Unlike shotguns, which have a more average damage per shot due to the number of pellets, a projectile weapon is completely hit or miss. You can be completely screwed over by no fault of your own if you happen to get unlucky with the direction of your rockets. So my suggestion is to change the flat 3 degrees of inaccuracy to have the same ramp-up system that the panic attack uses. Your first shot would be perfectly accurate like every other launcher, but every successive shot would drift slightly farther away from your crosshair. If we made the accuracy penalty be 1.5 degrees per shot, this would give you more control of where your first 2 rockets are going while leaving the third rocket on more completely unchanged from what we have now. This, in my opinion, is a lot closer to how the Beggars should work. Whether you can finish off an enemy at mid-range should not be dependent on RNG, so giving you at least a single accurate shot would help level things out while leaving the more spammy aspects of the Beggars unchanged. We would definitely have to be careful not to change tap firing, because what's effectively a rocket launcher with a bottomless clip does not need a buff. But if we made the accuracy penalty refresh after a second of not firing, I think we circumvent that problem pretty well. So yeah, I know the skill ceiling of the Beggars is high enough that its avid users may argue that it doesn't need to change in the first place, and if you've seen the numerous clip montages of nutty Beggars plays, you may be inclined to agree. But while I get where you're coming from, you have to remember that these clips are completely out of context, and for every impressive clip, I'm sure there are a handful of attempts that got completely screwed because of the RNG. So while I agree that the Beggars is easily one of the highest skill ceiling launchers in the game as it is, I don't think that's a reason to leave it with a luck-based mechanic. The Cow Mangler is among the stranger weapons in the game because it's one of the few unlockables that doesn't really have a niche. That's not to say that it's bad. In fact, I may even be in the minority for saying that it needs to be changed at all because in a lot of ways it's on par with stock. But the Cow Mangler is, as we say in the industry, fucking boring. To me, it's always felt like the Dr. Mario of rocket launchers, the weird semi-clone of the default pick that no one really likes even if it does get the job done. And while I don't think a lot of people know how to voice it, I feel that most people agree that something with the Mangler is lacking considering how infrequently I see this thing used. So to get people to use the Mangler more, I definitely like to see it have its own identity, or at least more use cases than being an excuse to not have to manage ammo. First of all, an easy stat we could give it is the ability to destroy enemy sticky bombs. Demo has a few weapons that do this exact thing, but Soldier has none, and the giant laser cannon that's known for disintegrating things would be a great choice for something like this. More importantly, though, I want to make the charge shot a lot more interesting than what it currently is. Right now, it feels like people either never use the charge shot or only use the charge shot, and ideally we want it to be something in the middle. I wouldn't say more damage is the answer, since spam is already a legitimate concern and that'd only make the problem worse, so ideally we give it some sort of utility. And while utility could be about anything, I think an interesting stat to play around with that the weapon would already accommodate pretty well is healing denial. As you probably know, the Cow Mangler charge shot inflicts afterburn every time it hits an enemy. Flamethrower afterburn already reduces healing, but for whatever reason the Cow Mangler's flavor of it doesn't. The main issue with this mechanic though is that while healing reduction from afterburn is a cool idea on paper, healing sources reducing the duration of damage over time effects makes it almost completely useless since you're only dealing with it for a few seconds at most. So what I'm suggesting is to make the charge shot's afterburn 1 have the flamethrower heal blocking ability, and 2 not have its duration reduced from mediguns and dispensers. You could still extinguish it with health packs and liquids and whatnot, but this would make the heal reduction actually mean something. And just to make it a wee bit more consistent, I'll also lower the charge time to 1.25 seconds down from the current 2. The giant slow-moving laser beam is already pretty easy to avoid, and you still have to completely reload after using it, so I don't think being a sitting duck for 2 seconds is necessary for balance. This would turn the charge shot from a gimmicky spam option into a solid team support tool that could be used to bust medic pockets. It would also make the Mangler rather powerful though, so just as a way to balance it out if there aren't engineers on the enemy team, I think we should add a very minor downside to compensate. The one that I'm going to suggest is a small healing penalty while the weapon is active because it fits the theme. It doesn't have to be anything huge, but enough to make the Mangler not just the direct upgrade when you're playing on servers without crits medics is probably necessary. The Cow Mangler is a hard weapon to handle because like the Liberty Launcher, there's really not too much to work with. But even if you don't like these specific changes, I hope that you could agree that the Cow Mangler deserves to have its own identity beyond being a rocket launcher that's slightly better at spamming. The airstrike is another primary that is in a mostly good spot as it is. It takes a little more finesse than most of Soldier's launchers to get full use out of, but a skilled airstrike soldier is a force to be reckoned with. I say that it's only in a mostly good spot though, because its penalties make it slightly worse than I'm guessing it was intended to be, which is a shame considering how neat the concept of the weapon is. The two biggest issues I run into with the airstrike are that number 1, the grounded damage is pretty bad, which makes it more restrictive to use on tighter maps, and number 2, the much bigger one, a lot of your time is spent reloading once you've racked up some kills, which means that you can't really really afford to make full use of the airstrike feature of the airstrike very often. The fixes then are pretty straightforward. Remove the base explosion size penalty to make grounded combat more doable, and add a small reload speed buff that increases every time you get a kill. If we did, say, a 5% faster reload speed for each head you have, as well as a flat increase of 15% at base, that gives you a 35% speed boost once you've hit the cap. Ideally, this would help the airstrike feel a lot less sluggish once you've gotten to higher rocket counts, because I'm honestly tired of watching the reload animation for this weapon. I also wouldn't be opposed to making kills also increase your max ammo in exchange for the explosion range penalty, because this is a weapon that requires you to blow through a ton of rockets to be effective with. But while running out of ammo is annoying, I get the feeling that ammo management is a legitimate downside of the weapon, so I will not push for that one too hard. Like most of the other primaries that I'm talking about, the airstrike isn't a perfect weapon as it is, and could definitely use a little something, but it works, I guess. It's definitely one of the most fun launchers to play with though, so I would definitely encourage you to try this one out if you haven't yet. And last up for primaries, the black box is once again a weapon that is almost fine as it is, but is just missing that little something that keeps it on par with everything else. 25% of your total damage output and mobility is a pretty big ask, and I think that while most people would agree that the healing from chip damage is nice, the long-term trade-off is really just not worth it. The issue that's unique to the black box though is that it can absolutely suck to fight against, seeing that it makes 1v1s a lot more difficult to win considering the sustain it provides to the soldier. So while the most optimal way to fix the black box would be to give it a different penalty than losing a rocket, there aren't very many ways of doing that would still keep the weapon fair. But this is all for fun, so we're gonna do it anyway. Let's start with the more reasonable change first though, which addresses one of the more subtle problems that the black box currently faces. For those unaware, back in gunmetal, the way the black box gave you health was changed in two major ways. First, instead of receiving what was a previously flat 15 health per enemy your rocket hit, the healing is now proportional to the total damage each rocket deals. This was done to stop players from spamming rockets in the choke points and refilling most of their health in seconds, and in my opinion was a great change to make to the weapon. But the not so great change they made on top of that was capping each rocket's total healing at a pitifully low 20, meaning that the healing you receive from firing at 2 or more enemies was completely neutered. Now this would be fine on its own, but you also lose a rocket, which is also something that destroys your effectiveness against groups. So my immediate solution then is pretty straightforward. Slightly round down the healing formula from the current 22% of the damage dealt to an even 20, and cap each rocket's maximum healing at 45. This allows Soldier to stay alive for a bit longer in team fights, while also keeping the healing from 1v1 duels untouched. When you're fighting groups of enemies, you're also going to be taking an entire group of enemies worth of damage, so the idea is that it evens out a little bit more. But the biggest issue that I can see with this design is that now you're even more obnoxious to take down if you have a pocket medic, so I think it's time we look at other potential downsides that don't involve sacrificing a rocket. For this route, we'd simply replace the clip size penalty with a sharply reduced healing from everything that's not your rockets. This would make you much more capable when roaming at the cost of having to be aggressive whenever you need to heal. You're still only getting about 20 health back from single target damage, which means that if you're at low health, you have to make a choice. Do you go in and risk dying in combat for some quick healing, or do you safely retreat but stay out of the fight for much longer than normal? Overall, I think having to make this choice would make the black box a much more interesting design that would bolster roamer playstyles while also toning down its effectiveness with medic girlfriends. Either way though, like the rest of Soldier's primaries, I would definitely accept an argument that the black box is fine enough to not need any changing, but at the end of the day it's still a weapon that's only like 90% of the way there, so I think topping it off is fun. Whether these changes effectively do that is debatable of course, so your no doubt kind and rational feedback is always appreciated. Moving to secondaries, the Mantreads is a very curious case of balancing, being one of those weapons that has a much higher quantity of upsides than its alternatives, yet still ends up being worse. The things it gives you are great for a rocket jumping playstyle, but because of the lack of innate damage resistance, you can't really afford to make use of its bonuses very often with most launchers. Outside of the very specific synergy it has with the rocket jumper, there isn't really much reason to use the Mantreads over the gunboats, which let you use your best form of mobility more than twice as often. What I don't think we should do is give this thing a self-damage resistance, because outside of me wanting to do that with another secondary, it's not what the Mantreads are trying to be. What I do think we could do though is give it a landing damage resistance. By giving the Mantreads the same fall damage reduction that's built into the thermal thruster, you get a very similar end result to a more traditional blast jump resistance. But this time, instead of taking less damage from the jumping part of the jump, you're more resistant to the landing part. Obviously, we'd have to make an exception to allow the Goomba Stomps to still deal full damage, but the thermal thruster already has that exact feature built in, so there really wouldn't be much of a problem porting it over. If we took this route with the Mantreads, I could definitely see them becoming a choice pick with the launchers that have built-in blast jump resistances. Even if the Mantreads don't currently pair well with most launchers, you can definitely feel the bonuses when you have them, so my hope is that this small push is all it needs to get people to want to use them more. Alternatively, if we wanted to turn them into a more generalist mobility option, I think something like that could be done pretty easily too. In fact, a grounded move speed bonus is all you'd really have to do to accomplish this. I've chosen to put 15% here because it puts Soldier right around the same speed as Demo Man, but if that ends up being too much, I'd be fine lowering it to 10. Honestly though, if you lower the push force reduction to something more reasonable, I think a an option like this would be perfectly fine. The gunboats already let you have incredible mobility on command, and considering you're passing up stuff like the banners and the shotguns to run these, I don't really think making Soldier walk a bit faster would be hugely unbalanced. But yeah, similar to the airstrike, I personally believe that the Mantreads have a ton of untapped potential that never really gets recognized considering how powerful the rest of Soldier's secondaries are, so hopefully a change like this one would end up slotting them better into his kit. As promised in the Demo Man video, I said I'd save the base jumper tweaks for soldiers, so here they are. The base jumper is one of those weapons that's super cool in theory, but in practice is a complete and total gimmick. Having a slow descent sounds like it could lead to some super cool bomber playstyles, and when paired with exactly the airstrike, it kinda can. But what usually ends up happening is that whenever you deploy the parachute, you become a sitting duck in midair, seconds away from being airshot or headshot into oblivion by the sweatiest player on this side of the Mississippi. In my experience, a weapon that only gives you a slow fall effect just isn't going to be good no matter how you tune the numbers. Even the original pre-nerf base jumper wasn't conventionally good, it was just annoying enough in certain situations to make people want it to be reworked. So assuming we wanted to keep the current physics as they are, I think there should be another passive stat to complement the parachute. One such stat that I think would make this a very interesting weapon would be a blast jump resistance, say about 35%. This would make the base jumper a close competitor to the gunboats. You can choose between getting either a lot more rocket jumps or just a few more rocket jumps but with the added ability to slow fall whenever you want. It's a very simple change, but in this case I think simple is better. For as often as the gunboats are used, they don't really have any sort of side grade option that works in a similar way, so I think some sort of redundancy is fine if it allows for variety. And even though I think most good soldiers would still prefer to stick with the option that benefits more frequent movement, it would still be super cool to have a slightly different choice to play around with. Alternatively, if we didn't want to shake up the meta that badly, I think we'd have to overhaul the current base jumper's physics to make it anywhere close to usable. Back in the day, it used to have incredibly tight controls, but the main complaint against it was that it was too easy to avoid air shots that otherwise deserved to hit. Well, in my humble opinion, if someone dodges your air shot, it did not in fact deserve to hit, but in very specific scenarios, stubborn soldier and demo players who refuse to switch to hit scan, I can see where that much air control would be slightly annoying. So my solution then is twofold. First of all, we revert most of the tough break nerfs, giving the base jumper back a good chunk of its old air control and its ability to redeploy, but this time on a 1-second cooldown. Second of all, we give the parachute a bit of vertical momentum on the first mid-air deployment, basically functioning as a quasi-double jump. The intent of this change is because you don't get any blast jump reduction outright, you instead get a completely free way to do the smaller jumps. Once again, this is a very simple change, but I think it would expand the versatility of the base jumper quite nicely. But yeah, at its core, I just don't think the base jumper is a weapon that will ever be able to function as just a slow fall device. A parachute for soldier is a super cool concept, but in practice it just doesn't have that many opportunities to benefit your gameplay. Hopefully either of these changes will put it back onto people's radars as a niche but solid utility side grade rather than just the weapon you use with the airstrike sometimes. Speaking of shared items, the reserve shooter is certainly a weapon that needs to see some sort of love. The problem that it and a few other of the shared weapons have, though, is that classes who have access to it want totally different things out of a shotgun. Soldier has a way to directly combo into the mini-crits and gets pretty decent use out of them as an anti-aerial tool. Pyro, on the other hand, has absolutely nothing that pairs well with the mini-crits and already has a way to shut down dive-bombing soldiers. So, because the required balancing is so different for each of the classes who can use the reserve shooter, I'm going to give this thing 4 total reworks. 2 of them will focus on both classes equally, and the other 2 will focus on a single class while ignoring the other. Trust me when I say that this arrangement will make a lot more sense in the Pyro video, so just bear with me. Anyway, if we wanted to make the reserve shooter a good side grade for both classes while also enforcing its current niche on soldier, all it really needs to work is a single but basic versatile stat to expand its use cases. If we gave it an accuracy bonus, for example, we not only reinforce its role as a combo tool for soldier, but we give Pyro a slightly longer range shotgun that would help his lacking mid-range combat by a fair bit. Both classes would get different benefits out of an accuracy buff, but this single change would cover nearly all of our bases quite well. Alternatively, if we wanted to be a bit more creative with what a shotgun can be, I think a really cool stat to have on a shotgun is that it can automatically reload while it's inactive. This is called the reserve shooter, after all. Having it specialize in being a weapon that's always ready at a moment's notice would be a great niche for a shotgun to fill. To balance this a little bit, I think we would have to make the offhand reload a little bit slower than the active reload, maybe 1 shell per second while inactive compared to the half second we have by default. But if we went this route with it, I could see this thing working well as an all-class shotgun similar to the panic attack, especially for engineer. Being able to upgrade buildings without having to take a break to reload would be an immensely helpful side grade to have access to. Whether losing 2 shells is enough to balance something like that out is debatable. I could definitely see that being increased to 3, but I think the concept is really cool and I want to stick with it. Alternatively, let's say that we wanted to take this in the complete opposite direction, where we only have to focus on how soldier can use the reserve shooter and pretend like Pyro doesn't even exist. If we did that, I think the most interesting stat we could add to a soldier shotgun would be to make it like a sort of ranged market gardener. Adding guaranteed mini crits while you're rocket jumping, and once again a small accuracy bonus would make this the roamer soldier's dream, comboing super well with primaries like the Liberty Launcher if you wanted to take advantage of its reduced self-damage. This would definitely be among the more gimmicky options I've suggested so far, and I don't think it would be as universally useful as the other two that I suggested earlier. But this is a concept that amuses me enough to stick with, and even then I think the reserve shooter is solid enough on Soldier already that it would see its fair share of users. Welp, here we are. Out of every weapon that I've covered or will ever cover in this series, we finally arrived at what is arguably the literal worst one. Words cannot describe how bad the Righteous Bison is if you have never used it before. To run the Bison, you are giving up, at minimum, a consistent mid-range hit scan option that does up to 90 damage per shot, never mind the utility options you could be using in its stead like the banners or the gunboats. And what you are getting in return is a janky projectile weapon that's incredibly easy to dodge, has horribly inconsistent damage, and has invisible downsides that make it even worse than what the actual stats would imply. There is, and I mean this, zero reason to ever use the Righteous Bison in any circumstance ever. Even the other worst weapon in the game has a niche use in man versus machine. The Righteous Bison has nothing to its name. So because of that, I'm going to make an exception to one of the cardinal rules of the series and completely overhaul the weapon in both reworks that I suggest. Normally I want to try as hard as I can to make at least one balance suggestion that's similar to what we currently have, but in this case I think there are just too many stats going against the Bison to make anything useful out of what currently exists. So the worst offender of the Bison's status, in my opinion, is the multi-hit stat. On the most bare-bones conceptual level, a projectile that does rapid tick-based damage while touching an enemy is a cool idea. The problem is that the amount of concessions you have to make for this to work properly is incredibly high. If the projectile is fast, it doesn't have too much time to spend inside of enemies, meaning that the total damage would be rather pathetic and you'd be better off having it only hit once. But if you make the projectile slow, it's suddenly much easier to avoid, meaning that dealing any damage at all becomes a real challenge if you aren't just spamming choke points. So because of that, I think it's best that we speed up the projectile significantly and make it do 1 instance of damage per target hit. I know it removes some of the uniqueness of the current design, but in my opinion, there's no way to have our cake and eat it too, so off the weapon it goes. That being said, I think that if we start from the basis of a fast-moving single-hit projectile instead of whatever garbage we have now, we can actually make a solid weapon out of the thing. The first route that I'll take with this idea is built around group damage from penetration rather than fighting single targets. The current Bison tries to do this. It fails, but at least it tries. So ultimately, I think that this is the closer of the two reworks to what we currently have in game. First of all, as mentioned earlier, I'm making the weapon deal 1 instance of damage to each target for the sake of consistency. I'm also opting to make the damage completely flat rather than being based on ramp up or fall off, doing exactly 60 damage to anyone that it hits. We will of course increase the projectile speed a bit, but only to the point where it's slightly slower than a direct hit rocket. After all, if this can do 60 damage at any range, I still think it should be relatively easy to dodge if you know that it's coming. And really, I think that's all you'd have to do to make the Bison a solid weapon. This would turn the Bison into a solid way to deal with groups of enemies that are being defended by skilled pyros. If your rockets aren't making it to the group, fire a few Bison shots into the crowd to force everyone to scatter and then pick off the stragglers, easy as that. However, my main concern with this design, and I'm sure yours as well, is that spam is just not very fun to deal with. It's a functional version of the Bison we have in game, sure, but I honestly don't know if that's what's best for the weapon. I think a much more compelling design is to make this into a mid to long range shotgun alternative that lets you easily finish off retreating enemies. For a rebalance like this, I'll once again make the damage into a single tick, but this time I'll increase its base damage to a slightly higher 64. This means that you're doing 76 damage at point blank, notably less than a shotgun meat shot, but at long ranges you can do a lot more if you can land your shots. In fact, I'll even fudge the numbers a bit and cap the maximum fall off at 75%, or 48 damage at max range, so that way it's actually viable against snipers if you can hit your shots. Increase the firing speed to match that of the shotgun, list the clip size penalty as an actual downside instead of something you have to discover for yourself, and there you go, a solid rework for the Bison. The only other thing that I'll note is that if we gave the Bison the same projectile speed as the Rescue Ranger, I do think it would be necessary to let pyros reflect the beams. It's a very niche opportunity for counterplay, but I do think it would help a little in deterring mindless spam at longer ranges. What this design leaves us with is a shotgun alternative that has its base damage compressed into a single projectile instead of pellets. It makes for a much better finish-off tool since it does a minimum of 48 damage, but it also requires you to lead your shots and still has considerably lower DPS than the shotgun up close. In my opinion, this is exactly what the Grodbort weapons should be. Side grades on equal footing with the shotguns that trade close range proficiency for long range. I understand that some people will inevitably be upset that I'm effectively gutting the current identity of the Bison, and because I don't like removing weapons from the game, I do see where you're coming from. But in this case, when we're dealing with a weapon that in its 10 years of existence has never once been good, I think it's a necessary evil to deal with. As fun as a gimmick weapon can occasionally be, I'd much rather have consistent side grade options that open up fun new ways to play the game. Gimmicks can be funny once, but alternative playstyles have longevity, and I think when we're designing weapons for a 15-year-old game, that's something we have to keep in mind. Anyway, ending Philosophy Hour and moving on to the buff banner, it's pretty good, so I'll keep things pretty brief. The only two changes that I think this thing needs are number 1, a minor passive stat to make it match the other banners, and 2, a slightly lower damage threshold required to fill the meter. For the passive stat, I'll add a 40% primary ammo bonus to keep it in line with its combat-oriented theme, and for the meter, I'll lower the damage required to fill the thing to 520 to match that of the Conjurer. All easy changes that the buff banner could definitely use to be on the same level of its cousins. Moving on to melee, surprisingly there aren't very many that I'd consider to be bad. For the shovel and the pain train, I think the running changes from the previous videos work fine, but there is one that I'm going to retcon because of some issues that people brought up. The shovel having a gunslinger-esque 3-hit crit ability would be perfectly fine, and ultimately that's the universal melee change that I want to stick with. But I've realized that giving a melee weapon random crits, even when crits are supposed to be off, is just not fun. As much as people pretend to like random crits because they think turning them off is for tryhards, no one wants to die in one shot to a weapon with janky hit detection, so for now we'll stick to the 3-hit crit design and maybe introduce something else down the road. And for the pain train, the single rework was intended to give it use in other modes via a capture range increase and a move speed bonus while capping the intelligence. I explained the reasoning in depth in the demo video in case you want to learn more there, but as far as how both of these changes pertain to Soldier, I think these would be alright. Overall, I don't have much to add, so let's move on to the other bad melee. The Equalizer, a weapon that is once again pretty cool in theory, but falls apart when you look at literally anything else you could be using instead. Outside of the obvious lack of utility, one of the biggest issues with the Equalizer is that it doesn't even do its main function all that well. It's supposed to be the de facto damage-dealing soldier melee, but considering how pitiful your hits are if you're above even half health, you're better off using anything else in most circumstances. Combine that with the fact that this thing scales completely linearly instead of having easily memorable thresholds, and you end up with a weapon that has consistency issues out the ass. So for the basic tweak, I think fixing these two things is our best bet. By bumping up the full health damage to the standard 65, rounding down the maximum damage to 105, and putting damage thresholds at every 40 health, you now have a weapon that does extremely predictable damage that's not completely horrible at higher health values. All you have to do to see how much damage you're doing is to take the 65 base damage and add 10 for every 5th of your health you're currently missing. Are you between 80 and 120 health? 85 damage per hit. Below 40 health, 105 each time. On top of letting you deal reasonable damage when at higher health values, this lets you very quickly calculate whether going for melee hits is worth it if you've been counting your damage. You just gotta do a little bit of mental math or memorize a table and you're set to go. But this also ignores one of the larger problems with the Equalizer that I mentioned earlier, and that it lacks any sort of utility whatsoever. Extra damage is nice and all, but compared to the sheer mobility of the escape plan and team support of the disciplinary action, it's rarely going to be your best option. The Equalizer is supposed to be the inverse of the escape plan, and considering the design of the escape plan is to run away from the enemy, I think the Equalizer should encourage you to run toward them. The best way to do this, in my opinion, is to give some sort of reward for finishing off enemies with melee kills in a very high-risk, high-reward situation. And the best way to incentivize doing that is to make the on-kill effect synergize well with being at low health, like, say, healing. More specifically with this design, getting a kill would restore half the health you're currently missing, as well as reloading all of your weapons instantly. This means that you're getting back around 100 health if you're next to dead, but almost nothing if you kill someone while you're nearly full. I also understand that reloading both your primary and your shotgun instantly would be rather powerful, so I wouldn't be opposed to making it only reload your rocket launcher if that seems more fair. I still think using damage thresholds is a good idea for this version of the Equalizer, but since getting kills now provides you with pretty sizable benefits, I think keeping the lower damage at high health would be ideal. In fact, I'd even go as far as to add a new threshold that further lowers the damage while overheal just to reduce the potential synergy this would have with medic pockets. But overall, I think this sort of thing is what the Equalizer should aim to be, a good desperation tool that actually rewards you for taking a risk and landing a melee kill at low health. The only other concern that I'd have with this design is that the healing is very similar to the half Zatoichi in concept, but I feel like on top of the half Zat not being really balanced around Soldier, the use cases are still pretty different. The half Zatoichi takes forever to deploy but gives you more health, the ability to overheal, consistent damage, and extra melee range in exchange for punishing you if you don't manage to land the kill. That all means that it supports a more melee-centric Soldier playstyle rather than being a good utility in a traditional one. Not to mention, the half Zatoichi is way better when used at high health but completely sucks if used at low, pretty much the opposite of what the Equalizer is trying to be. So anyway, ignoring the potential toes that the second design may be stepping on, the Equalizer could at least use something to get it off the ground. It has a pretty pathetic existence currently, being the only definitively bad Soldier melee, so buffs of any kind would be greatly appreciated. And finally, the last change that I want to make is to the Market Gardener. I will note that no, the Market Gardener is not by any stretch of the imagination a bad weapon, so don't go spreading rumors that I think that, but there is one specific quality of life adjustment that I do think it could really use that I don't have anywhere else to talk about. While you're rocket jumping, I think the Market Gardener should have the crit glow, making it visually apparent whether your next hit will be a crit. This would not only help new players learn the weapon weapon much easier, but it would also give experienced soldiers feedback on whether they've actually hit their bunny hops. It's a very simple change that would be incredibly easy to implement, and it's one that I've wished was in the game for 10 years now. So anyway, those are my thoughts on how to fix Soldier's worst weapons. As you can probably gather from the way that I describe most of the weapons that I talked about, Soldier has very few that I consider to be outright bad. But again, I think in a perfect state of game balance, every weapon should be used roughly equally, which is a pretty big goal to accomplish, but it's one that's fun to think about regardless. If you have feedback, feel free to let me know in a comment, though I will remind you that these changes are what I personally think would be cool to try out rather than a definitive take on what should happen to the future of the game. As far as this series goes and why I abandoned it for 6 months, oops. Contrary to what some people were speculating, the negative response to some parts of the Demo Man video did not just kill the series, I just sort of started working on other things and never got back around to this one. But here we are, better late than never, I suppose. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like. If you hated this video, I sentence you to 5 minutes of using the Bison in casual, and most importantly, have a good one.